All right, welcome back to classical Greece. We were talking about Alexander the Great and building up to something called Hellenism here. In the previous video, we had talked about Philip II, how he had conquered Greece. He is stabbed to death at his daughter's wedding, and his son Alexander takes over at the age of 20. What we're going to see here is Alexander taking apart the Persians bit by bit. So in the previous video, we had talked about how Alexander had met Darius III, who was then the leader of Persia, had met him at the Battle of Granicus River and was able to defeat Darius there. And Darius ran away. It's going to be kind of a theme here. And because of that, Alexander now controls Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey. So you kind of use a little scorecard here to kind of think about the land that Alexander has, because naturally he's going to have Macedonia. That's where he and his father were from. His father conquered Greece, so he's got Greece as well, and now he's got Turkey. So his empire is growing quite quickly. And remember, he's in his early 20s at this point. He's a very young man. So, moving on. So the next thing Alexander's going to do is he's going to go down to the breadbasket of this area. He's going to go down to Egypt. Well, Egypt at the time was controlled by the Persians. So in 332 BC, Alexander marches into Persian-controlled Egypt. He goes in here expecting there to be a fight. There's no reason to think there wouldn't be a fight. But there isn't one. He's welcomed by the Egyptians as a liberator. And they actually crown him pharaoh. They call him God. And this is significant because, people have coveted Egypt since the time of the ancient Egyptians, which was, quite a few years before this. And so now he's got a lot of different territory, which includes Macedonia, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. The result is Alexander has control of Egypt. One of the things Alexander does everywhere he goes is he builds cities. He builds Greek cities. He takes Greek ideas and he builds basically new capitals, and he names every one of those cities after him. So he builds an Alexandria everywhere he goes, and one of the most famous cities of the ancient world in Egypt is Alexandria. So it's one of several, but we're going to talk about that city a little bit later in this PowerPoint. Next, Alexander sets his sights on Mesopotamia. In a lot of ways, this is the heart of the Persian Empire, or at least what they have left. They've lost Turkey, they've lost Egypt, but they're still hanging on. There's still a lot of land left to conquer. So Alexander takes his troops, and he's going to fight the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela. 250,000 Persians are there to fight him under Darius III again. Well, Alexander launches a massive phalanx attack, followed by a cavalry charge, and just like what happened in the past, those Persian lines crumbled. And as we mentioned earlier this unit, you have to remember the Persians, because of the groups they conquered over their history, they were a collection of a lot of different groups speaking a lot of different languages, and that gives you a huge disadvantage. For the most part, all of Alexander's army speaks Greek. So they have a better ability to communicate with one another. So after he defeats this army here, Darius again runs away. Darius flees in battle yet again. And this leaves Alexander with the entire Persian Empire. When you take the heart of it, when you take Mesopotamia, there's not much left out there for the Persians to have. So from this point on, the Persians are basically, they're on the defensive. They're running away. So the result of this is Alexander has control of all of the Persian Empire. Look at what we've done here, folks. Philip II conquered Greece. Alexander conquers the Persians. We have the end of two big civilizations here. Doesn't mean that there's not any more Greeks anymore. Doesn't mean there isn't Persians anymore. But their leadership is no longer under their own control. And that's a big point in history. So if we take a look at this, look how big Alexander's empire is. Here we've got Macedonia. He's got Greece. He's got Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. Moved down here to Egypt, took all of that. Here's where Mesopotamia was. And when you grab Mesopotamia, you basically take the rest of this. So it's literally the same size as the Persian Empire, plus this region right here, because the Persians never conquered this region. Remember, they tried in Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, but they did not take Greece nor Macedonia. So Alexander's empire was massive. At that point in time, in the 330s BC, it was the largest empire ever. Of course, the Mongols, about 1,600 years later, will have a much bigger empire. But it's worth noting at this point in time in history, it was the largest that had existed. So other conquests by Alexander. Well, he's going to travel to India. And while he's doing that, he's chasing down Darius the whole time. And he finds out Darius was murdered by his own men. And he actually, he's a little sad by this. I mean, Darius was his enemy. But at the same time, he shows respect. And even goes to Darius's burial and, pays his respects. The next thing he does, though, is he tells his troops, we're going east to India. And none of these guys had been to India yet. They had heard stories of monsters that existed there. Well, they're elephants. And people were kind of frightened. But here's the deal. His soldiers kind of mutiny on him. They basically say, Alexander, we love you. But we're not going any further. We've been fighting with you for 11 years. Let us go home and see our wives and our kids again. His soldiers were absolutely exhausted. They'd been fighting for 11 years. They had covered 11,000 miles. And they basically force Alexander to turn around and come home. Alexander does execute some of his men who mutiny against him here, but I think he ultimately sees the writing on the wall and says, yeah, you're right. We probably should go home and recuperate. If I want to get India, I can always go back there later. Well, that doesn't work out so well for Alexander because it's on this trip home that Alexander dies from illness at the age of 32. He's very young. Imagine if he had lived to be 50 or 60 years old, you can only imagine what he would have accomplished. He's sure in his short lifetime, really being in power for about 12 or 13 years, he accomplished a lot. Conquered the Persians, took over Egypt, able to keep that empire together. But that doesn't mean the empire is going to last much longer after him. So Alexander does die from illness at age 32. So we look at Alexander's legacy. We have to ask, now what? I mean, he did a lot. He brought people together. He conquered different territories. But the question the people would have been asking really is, now what? I mean, what do we do with all this land? So they broke the empire up into three main territories. And we actually saw this with the Mongols. Now remember, the Mongols come much, much later. But this tends to happen when you have somebody who has a large empire like this, and if the successors don't know how to keep it together, it's kind of a good governing strategy to say, all right, let's break it up into a couple smaller pieces so that we can run these pieces of land properly. And these three main territories would last for several centuries. Probably the biggest legacy piece that we get out of Alexander, we say, what's the big deal about all this land he conquered? It's Hellenism. Hellenism, or Hellenistic culture, is the blending of Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Indian influences. Think about that. When we use this map here, we could probably add Macedonia to this list too. If we just look at all the areas he conquered, he came from Macedonia, so he's got Macedonian culture. He's got Greek culture, because that's who he and Philip wanted to be, and they conquered Greece. Naturally, they conquered Egypt, so we're going to add Egyptian culture to that. And he conquered all of Persia. So that's what we've got here. We've got the blending of Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and a little bit India. He doesn't get far into India, but he does get a little bit of Indian culture in there. So we're basically talking about all these different people now have access to culture that they never had before. And like I told you, Alexander built Alexandrias everywhere he went. He brought Greek culture. He built gymnasiums. He built schools in all of these cities. And of course, people are going to take advantage of that. And you're just going to see the blending of culture over the next several hundred years. And this would forever transform Greece and Asia. So when we talk about how this affected Greece and the surrounding areas, there's no doubt that all these people now had access to knowledge and language and information that they never had before because of Alexander. A couple of things we get out of this. I told you he built several Alexandrias. Alexandria here in Egypt was a very big center for trade, and probably the most recognizable feature of Alexandria was this 350-foot lighthouse that you see here pictured. And if you've seen Alexander Engineering and Empire, and again, most of you have, you know that this was the first lighthouse ever built. And it's not there anymore. They think an earthquake brought it down, but they think they have found bits and pieces of it in the harbor right there by it. So this was really a first in the world here at Alexandria. One of the other things that Alexandria had was a library with 250,000 scrolls. This is another kind of a first in history. We kind of saw this with Nineveh in the Assyrian Empire, but here's one of the first places where learning becomes a commodity. Basically, you'd have ships come to harbor. They'd say, hey, what kind of information do you have on board? Do you have any maps? Do you have any documents? And those documents would be turned over to this library. They'd be copied. And of course, the copies would then be returned to these ships so that they were able to hoard all this information. Most of it burned, unfortunately. Most of it was lost, but we do have records that say it existed. So Alexandria here, this Alexandria, was significant for those reasons. A couple other things that come out of this Hellenistic period in science and technology. We got a guy named Euclid who wrote the book called The Elements, which became the basis for geometry. So for those of you who've done geometry, you know your proofs and whatnot, you can sort of thank Euclid for coming up with that. Archimedes is another thinker who came out of this time period. He accurately estimated pi at 3.14. Of course, it goes way beyond that. As you can see here, there are people who memorize that to like the 100th digit. I don't know why. I'd rather play video games or watch a movie or something, but there are people who do that and are very good at it. And the last one is Hero. And Hero we heard about in the video Alexander Engineering and Empire. He invented this device, which really was the first to harness steam power, which was way ahead of its time. Nobody really used it for much, but at least it shows that people were thinking of using steam power long before the steam locomotive ever became a reality in Europe. All right, that brings us to our end, our result. Through Philip II and Alexander's conquest of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians, ideas would spread and cultures would combine in a way that had never been seen before. Again, that's the idea of Hellenism. You bring cultures together, you give them education, you build them gymnasiums. They are eventually going to take on characteristics from one another. So after Alexander's death, the Greek civilization would gradually decline until many of their achievements and ideas would be absorbed into perhaps the greatest example of Hellenism in history, the Roman Empire. And so naturally our next unit is going to be Rome. A lot of the ideas established here by the Greeks, by the Persians, by Alexander, they would just move west over to Italy. And you'd have the next big empire that would rise here called the Roman. All right, we're going to wrap up our story here by taking another look at our constructive response question that we have to answer for today's notes. The question says, trace the development of Alexander the Great and his accomplishments. And really, we have to start by answering this question by looking at Philip. You know, Philip trains his army, the Macedonians, into this really, really great army. They extend the phalanx formation. They use the giant 18-foot pikes. He just really turns them into a formidable fighting machine, and they conquer Greece. Well, of course, then he dies, and Alexander takes over, and we're able to see how Alexander takes over Egypt, how he takes over Mesopotamia, and he basically takes bits and pieces of the Persian Empire. We could certainly talk about how he's welcomed as a liberator in Egypt. We could talk about his battle tactics, which we looked at during the notes, how he's able to break the Persian lines, causing Darius to flee, and really bringing these pieces of land together. But one of his greatest accomplishments is Hellenism. And we talked about that. Hellenism really is a blending of Macedonian culture, Greek culture, Egyptian culture, Persian culture, and a little bit of Indian culture, as he and his troops do make it over to really the most western part of India. That is probably his greatest accomplishment. And everywhere Alexander went, he built a city called Alexandria. They were Greek cities. They spoke Greek. They had Greek amphitheaters. They had gymnasiums. And that's an accomplishment. You're bringing people together. You're making them part of something new. So it really does shape the lives of the people there. And Alexander would have thought for the better. And I think certainly we can argue that. So this whole blending of culture is known as Hellenism, and that's probably Alexander's greatest accomplishment. But that doesn't come without conquering a lot of land first. So you can go ahead and rate yourself on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale here and practice this question. And that's going to do it for us. So hopefully you learned something. We'll see you next time.